I think it is a true foldable. If I were to guess, I think they're going to call it the iPhone Ultra. You really can't go a step above a foldable, right? Like the foldable is the ultimate, the ultra expression of these things, right? And so I think that's the Ultra. I don't see them doing a phone in between the Pro and Fold. So the foldable would be the Ultra. I would not be interested in a Z Flip style foldable iPhone, but a Z Fold, I don't care how much that thing costs. I'm getting one, right? Like all bets are off.
John, we've got a crazy week going on right now. We got a lot to talk about. We didn't have time to do intros.
I mean, I would just say that we have, always breaking news coming through here.
Right, probably the best in the business for, I don't know how long I've known this man. I feel like I've known him since he was in middle school.
Oh, that's been funny.
It's been a minute.
And that's not even a joke. This is Mr. Mark Gurman. How are you doing, sir?
I'm good. Thank you both for having me. Certainly has been an interesting couple weeks.
It sure has.
For Apple. I remember, obviously, we've talked about this before, but obviously, John for Lakers back in the day, Gear Live back in the day.
Yeah.
Has been following all that stuff for years, inspired by both of you. I remember, John, what was your first video? Was it a MacBook Pro?
Yeah, my MacBook Pro unboxing.
Yeah. Andrew, I don't recall, but I'm sure it was great too.
We can't go anywhere. I can't go anywhere online now without seeing your name somewhere or some, according to the Powered On newsletter. I mean, everywhere we go, and there's a lot, especially the past few weeks for you. It's been kind of percolating.
You've been knocking stuff out the park.
Thank you. It's been busy. I mean, so let's just talk about the products for a second. The iPads were pretty minor, I have to say, but I still think they're going to give Apple some momentum. One thing they talked about a little bit on the earnings call, obviously at Bloomberg, I have to follow this stuff very closely, but they kept mentioning the iPad Air over the past few earnings calls. And it was a little surprising because this is kind of just like out of nowhere. Nobody talks about the iPad Air. It's really the iPad Pro. There you have your iPad mini fanatics, but like the iPad Air is kind of like, who cares? But it seems like the iPad Air is doing super well. In my personal speculation, I'm curious what you guys think. $799 for the 13-inch. I mean, that's just like a ridiculous price, right? I mean, you're getting pretty much everything in the iPad Pro, other than a few things, for like $800. You got all the storage options. You got the color options. To me, it's like, I don't use one, but based on the specs and my testing of it, that's like the de facto recommendation if people are asking for which iPad to get. And so, of course, they're going to update it. They gave it the M3 chip, but it's just more of a marketing cycle rather than anything interesting. I haven't gotten my hands on it yet. Have you guys had a chance to test it out?
Andrew has.
I dropped my review yesterday. Yeah, I mean, it's...
I need to watch it, yeah.
In John's words, it's an iPad, right? Like it's great, it's fast, it's fluid, but I don't know what you're going to be doing on this iPad that you weren't doing last year. That's not to say that I like to see companies iterate quickly. Like if you have something new and it's going to be the same price, update it and put it out there so that anyone buying today gets the best version of whatever it is today versus waiting for something longer term. But I think the only real difference, and again, this is very niche, is going to be the hardware accelerated ray tracing and mesh shading, and the faster GPU. So it's really for gaming and and then applications that you would get an iPad Pro for anyway. So I don't know.
I think really since the M1 went into an iPad, there's been so much headroom in the iPad line. I'd be curious, Mark, future of iPadOS. Obviously, we got some Pro apps people have been clamoring for. Are we going to see the iPad become like a PC product or just sort of a larger iPhone with slightly different UI tweaks?
So let's just take a step back here. So
yeah,
the iPad has been so interesting. I feel like if you go back in time, starting 2015, when the first iPad Pro came out, you read all of the reviews about the iPad Pro. And it's always something like the iPad Pro is more pro, but it's still an iPad, right? It still has the fundamental constraints of an iPad. That means lack of multi-window, multitasking to the same fluidity and aggressiveness that you would get on a Mac. It means using the iPad and iOS app ecosystem instead of the macOS ecosystem. So those are two big things. They've tried to bridge the gap a little bit with the Magic Keyboard. Obviously, that came out a few years ago. And it's interesting because what you're seeing is them pushing the iPad to be more like a Mac, but they're not yet pushing the Mac towards being more like an iPad, right? And so while you're getting that keyboard and trackpad functionality on the iPad, you're not yet getting the touchscreen functionality on the Mac. So my anticipation is, and we'll get into my breaking news story in a minute, which just came out, they're not going to merge the iPadOS and macOS operating systems, but they're going to make them look basically identical, right? They're going to better unify the design language and everything across the board, make it more consistent. My belief is that they're still going to bring touchscreens to the Mac. They're going to continue, obviously, to offer the keyboard and trackpad for the iPad. And so your main differentiators on the Mac and iPad no longer going to be software-based. The main differentiators are going to be performance, battery life, and versatility. So the iPad is going to be more versatile because you can use it as a touchscreen or use it with the keyboard and trackpad. It's going to be more versatile because you can use it with the Apple Pencil. Obviously, it's thinner than lighter. The Mac, though, you're going to get better performance, obviously Pro and Max chips versus the baseline chip. You're also going to get better battery life and bigger screen sizes. So the software story, the user interface story, that is going to finally be consistent. And so my breaking news story is that Apple's planning the biggest software overhauls in its modern history. So think 2 decades for this year's OSs, iOS 19, iPadOS 19, and macOS 16. And part of that is going to be unification across the design language of the operating systems. You're going to see some loosely based design principles from Vision OS. But more importantly, you're going to see them overhaul how people are using these devices with an eye on next generation of users. It's a big risk. Obviously, the Photos app was one user interface design overhaul, and we saw some backlash there, and it was one app, albeit a very important app, right? But changing the look and feel of not only one operating system, not only 2 operating systems, but 3 operating systems, this is going to be interesting. And, you know, I think users are excited about this, but also, and I'll let you guys speak in a second, it's a big distraction from their recent failings in AI too. Not saying they did it because of that, but, you know, the story is now shifting.
That's what I was going to ask as you were speaking. Like, what you just said sounds monumental, and at the same time, they've had something else monumental, or at least that they've been professing to be monumental with the whole, you know, Siri and app intents and being able to know your personal context, which, as we saw, they said it's going to take them longer than they thought. And without saying it, they kind of punted it into the next release of all their software. And now you're saying it sounds like they're not just that, but they're taking on a tremendous undertaking to just redesign everything. I think you were the one who reported, though, that they kind of were behind on, I don't know if it was behind on iOS 19 features or just like moved some stuff later down the line as well because of all the iOS 18 stuff. Is this new design language like 100% a go? We're going to see it at WWDC?
That's a go. We're going to see it at WWDC. The stuff that's been punted are more so individual features, maybe some new applications, maybe some new controls and such. But the theme, the design theme, that stays the same. That's one tentpole, right? And that has been the focus of Apple's software engineering group. And that, in addition to the AI stuff, has led them to have to shift back some of the more individual components, according to the people I've spoken to in Craig Federighi's org, right? And so this is just, I think, a phenomenal development for Apple product users, but it's going to be very interesting. I'm very curious on your thoughts when you get your hands on it and when you review it for your viewers. It's going to be the talk of the second half of the year, this new design. It's a dramatic shift. I mean, the way you use your devices, the way they look is going to change forever.
So just for follow-ups, is this part of a multi-step process to get to unification, or is this the unification with iOS 19?
So it's consistency, and I think of some semblance of unification on the design side, right? Okay. They're not going to unify the operating systems into one. The underlying architectures, the app ecosystems, those will remain the same. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, if you use a Mac and an iPhone, there's a lot of similarity and there's a lot of overlap. There's also a lot of icons that are different. There's menu bars that are different. There's controls that are different. Obviously, Vision OS looks like a completely different beast to iOS. Part of the reason why is because you need the shadows and the 3D and the translucency because you're in a mixed reality or an AR and VR environment. But there are ways to apply some of that to the 2D environment that is the iPhone, the iPad, and the Mac. And so you're going to see some of that. But this is a fundamental end-to-end re-architecture of how the devices look and feel from the software side.
Do you see the typical use cases changing? So the typical iPad use case, typical Mac use case changing or being more fluid, or you still see Mac for creation, iPad for consumption? Or is the envisioning here is that there's much more fluidity between the use cases with these?
I think there's going to be more fluidity and more consistency. I think the fundamental thing to realize is that they're not going to go as far as merging the operating systems. They're going to still showcase why you're going to want a Mac for some things and iPad for other things. Steve Jobs used to say, you want to cannibalize yourself before someone else cannibalizes you. And I think Apple still believes in that to some extent, but clearly with the way they're handling their operating systems, they don't believe in it. They believe they want to make their $40 billion a year from the Mac. They want to make their $40 billion a year from the iPad. And they believe that's always going to make them more money than one product that subsumes everything into one device. I think at some point, you're going to want a hybrid, a convertible. Maybe they will offer that at some point. I think the foldable iPad is going to get us in an entirely new direction. I think it's going to be really hot. But I certainly think they are starting to go in the right direction. And they have to go on that very fine line of how we can make these products more similar, but also more powerful. And also on top of that, do it in a way that's not going to compromise consumer willingness and our marketing ability to fill both.
Can we talk about those foldables? The thought that it's one path is iPad, one path is iPhone. Story today about perhaps under display Face ID for an iPad. What do you see coming first, or what is going to be fundamentally different about Apple's approach to foldables and what we've seen in the past?
The phone is going to come first. The phone should arrive at the end of next year. I think there's been some reporting, either based on there being multiple prototypes or whatever, on the form factor of this phone. I think the consensus to date has been that it's going to be of the ilk of the Z Flip, which is the square one. You flip it open. And on the surface, why does that make sense? It makes sense because you're retaining the same iPhone form factor. It's just folded in half and it opens. And so the benefit of that is you're getting the same amount of screen real estate, right, in a smaller package to put in your pocket or bag or whatnot. I don't believe they're going in that direction. I believe it's the same form factor as the Z Flip, meaning that the phone is the same size, but it can open to even more screen real estate. I understand
Z Fold.
Sorry, Z Fold. Yes. So I understand why a company like Samsung would offer both. Maybe there'll be a universe in which Apple eventually offers both. But from a technology and a utility standpoint, thinking about myself here, I would not be interested in a Z Flip style foldable iPhone. But a Z Fold, I don't care how much that thing costs. I'm getting one, right? Like all bets are off. I've had multiple Samsung Folds, the big ones, over the years. That is like the most impressive smartphone in my experience and in my opinion in the market. Apple's not going to go here for years, if ever, but I played with someone's trifold phone a few weeks ago. That thing's just nuts. I mean, that's just amazing. Like for me, biggest and best and baddest you can get, I'll be first in line for the iPhone Fold.
So the book style coming first for people who maybe aren't familiar with the
book style, kind of
to open it up, and then potentially towards the end of next year.
Yeah.
Is that so that's going to be positioned as a phone with a multi-purpose displays instead of a phone that changes to an iPad or something along those lines?
Yes, but it's interesting because there's also going to be another new iPhone, not a tweaked design, but an all-new form factor design that I believe is end of next year as well. Like, I'm not sure the phone this year is considered a redesign other than the camera bar and some of the materials and such, but there is going to be a pretty big redesign for the phones next year as well, maybe for the 20th anniversary. And so on the market you're probably going to have competition between this foldable phone and this big revamp, right?
Across the line, or is it like one new?
I've heard about it specifically for the pros. The iPhone Pro revamp is next year. And alongside that will be the foldables. Don't forget, this foldable is going to be, I would not be surprised if it's $2,500, right? Maybe 22, somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000, right? It's going to be pricey. The margins on getting the screen right the yields are very low. And so that's going to be expensive. So don't forget, you still need, if you're Apple, a phone in the $1,000 to $1,500 range. So they're going to have to revamp that as well at some point, right? Because the design this year will have some changes, but overall it's still the same thing we've had since 2020, right? So you're going to need that. So if you look at the iPhone roadmap in totality, the next few years are very strong, right? You've got the sort of, I would say, moderate changes to the Pros this year. You've got the Air, which is a really big deal. And I'll write about, and probably next weekend or this upcoming weekend, I'll write about why the Air is such a big deal and sort of the backstory there. And then the following year, you've likely got the foldable, right? And the revamped Pros together, right? And so if you look at it, you've got 3 major new form factors for the iPhone coming in the next 24 months. Well, yeah, 2 years.
So two parts to follow that up. What's going to be unique about the Fold? We've heard the elimination of the crease. And then is there anything you can share about the redesign for the 18 Pro?
I don't think the crease is going away as much as some have articulated. The way it's been explained to me is decreased crease. It's not...
decreased, I like the pun.
It's decreased, that's funny. It's not going... I don't think it's technically possible that it's going away. It's not going to feel like plastic overlay like you may feel like on the Samsungs right now, but it'll definitely have that heightened quality. And I also don't think it's like the Surface, the Surface Duo, where it's like 2 separate panels. Yeah. I think it is a true foldable. If I were to guess, this is just a guess, I think they're going to call it the iPhone Ultra. But that's a guess. That would be the Ultra,
okay.
Yeah, that would be the Ultra. Yeah, because I think this other new design I'm hearing about is just a revamp to the Pros. So that would be the Ultra, because you really can't go a step above a foldable, right? Like the foldable is the ultimate, the ultra expression of these things, right? And so I think that's the Ultra. I don't see them doing a phone in between the Pro and the Fold. So the foldable would be the Ultra. Plus, they're not going to call it the same thing that Samsung calls it. I guess Samsung has Ultras also, but to me, I mean, I swear, I'm just guessing here, it's about the Ultra name. Like, to me, if I was Apple's marketers and I have to pick from their tried and true naming conventions, Ultra would be it. It already works on the Apple Watch. Then they have the chips and whatnot. In terms of the design of the 18 Pro, not going to get into that today because I haven't written about it. But another time, have me back. So
fair enough. You mentioned earlier a foldable iPad and I think John was alluding to this as well. Is a foldable iPad a separate product from this foldable iPhone, or is this kind of the same?
So the foldable phone comes first. The foldable iPad comes later. The foldable iPad the idea there is that it's the size of two, I believe it's the two 11-inch iPad Pros side by side. So it's like the Microsoft Courier.
That's a deep cut.
That's a very deep cut.
So I'm going to manifest the iPhone Ultra for a minute if I can. How are they going to handle biometrics? Will it be a revamped Touch ID and a button?
I saw there was the Ming Chi Kuo thing over the weekend about Touch ID in the button. To me, that makes sense only because the individual panels are so thin that being able to get the Face ID sensor in there, to me, seems preposterous. Like, I mean, Apple could probably figure it out, but like, it requires some depth. And so it doesn't make sense from a mechanics standpoint, because you're talking about two panels that are basically 4.5 millimeters thin, right? We're between 4 and 5 millimeters thin. And fine, you can get some cameras in one. Oh, we should talk about the camera thing, but like, yeah, the Touch ID thing makes perfect sense to me because it just doesn't make sense that you'll be able to get Face ID in there.
And they would need 2 instances of Face ID, I would assume, for the outer display and the inner display.
And yeah, you would need the outer and the inner. And it just seems like in this instant, it would be so much easier for them to pull off Touch ID. And then I would bet that the camera button and Touch ID button become one button, right? They would merge the two. But I don't know. Maybe it's up. I would assume, but I don't know that for fact. But the other thing to understand here is there's probably going to be a pretty big ass camera bump on the foldable phone, right? Because 4 millimeters, you can't do anything in that. You can't do anything in right?
Yeah,
in terms of camera physics and right. So I think the camera bump's going to be a big story. Andrew, I think you're holding some foldable phones there, right? How big are the camera bumps on those?
So they're not too big, but what I was actually looking at on these foldables was the button layout.
Tell us which ones you got there.
So I've got a Google Pixel Fold 9 Pro, whatever it's called, 9 Pro Fold. I've got a Samsung Galaxy one. I've got a OnePlus. All of these, so what I wanted to see was how the button layout was on the side, because obviously the iPhone has buttons on both sides. They all only have buttons on one side. So they'd have to combine the camera control, the power button, the action button, and the volume all on one.
Because of the hinge.
Unless they do it differently. Right, because the hinge on the other side doesn't support a button, and they're not going to put 2 layers of buttons on one side. That's interesting. I was just curious how that would look.
It's going to be fascinating. In terms of like upcoming stuff in the Apple pipeline, the foldable phone to me is number one. There's really not much else after that.
I want to talk a little bit, I want to be respectful of time here, about Apple Intelligence.
Yes, I think we have to get to that.
I think that's obviously been a big story. It was the story, last WWDC, what it was going to be. Then we got the hardware. We were told features were coming. There were commercials that were launched touting new features. And
you remember, there was even before WWDC, remember they had an interview and someone asked them, hey, you feel like you're behind in AI? And they just laughed at the interviewer like, no, we've got this handled. Wait till you see what we have coming. It was like the hubris.
Yeah. So
I think about it. Those 2 guys who did the interview, that was John Turnus and Johnny Srouji. They're basically in charge of hardware at Apple. Like, they don't care. I mean, I don't want to speak for them, but like in terms of their business lines, they've got the 2 safest things, right? Apple, I would argue, has the best hardware and it has the best internal components too. So like those 2 guys are good. Fair enough. In terms of the way the Apple executive team actually operates, that they are all responsible for their individual business units, but as a collective, they're responsible for the whole company. Anyways, back to you, John.
So I want to phrase the question differently, because I think, and I've done this, it's probably easy and perhaps rightfully so to pile on Apple for their shortcomings with Apple Intelligence. And that may be the case. And I want to ask you if that is the reason that they've fallen behind because of their emphasis on privacy? Is that a valid reason, or are they just behind because they are just behind and they deserve the criticism that they're getting for it?
So the reason that ChatGPT and all these other softwares for AI is able to work so effectively is because of GPU performance, being able to get their hands on the right GPU. But a big part of it is data collection. And the fact that Apple is not collecting data on its customers, the fact that Apple has this privacy stance has absolutely held them back in their ability to capture enough quality data to really power these things effectively and learn from its users, which basically is what artificial intelligence is. So I think the privacy thing has created a lot of good for them. Obviously, it's a key marketing point for their products. But the downside of what it's done for its artificial intelligence efforts is, to me, it's quite obvious. But to your point, the privacy thing is one bullet in a long laundry list of why Apple Intelligence essentially amounts to vaporware. I mean, Tim Cook goes on his earnings call and he talks about how people will love these features. They're going to be able to not live without them in the future. I mean, really? I mean, are you using any Apple Intelligence features on a day-to-day basis?
I use the ones that it does for me, like the summarization and things like that. I'm not seeking out writing tools.
So
Right.
how did they epically misjudge what they needed to do or the work that still needed to be done to deliver on the timeline that they set? How did they miss that mark?
Well, they missed the mark because the privacy stuff. They decided that they want to focus on heavily integrating these features into apps versus making Apple Intelligence something that you're corresponding with throughout your use cases of these devices. And they missed the mark primarily because I'm not sure they saw this coming to the extent. I mean, the story goes that Craig Federighi was trying out ChatGPT or Copilot over the Christmas break heading into 2023, right? And by then, all bets are off, right? Like the gun has been fired and the horses are way ahead and, Apple's just starting to figure out what a horse is, right? It's really unbelievable. And that's not entirely fair. I mean, Apple's had its artificial intelligence division for 15 years. And the saddest part about it is they had a 4-year head start. Siri came out 4 years before Amazon Alexa came out half a decade before Google or Microsoft were thinking of these things. Can you imagine, like, today, if ChatGPT had a 4-year head start, right?
Please.
I mean, it's a systematic, fundamental issue. I mean, Apple's just never been good at artificial intelligence. The good part, let me just say this, the good part for them
please.
is that they're very strong marketing pushes, their hardware, software integration, the stickiness of the iPhone ecosystem. Because they have all that, they're able to withstand being so behind. But at some point, they will get superseded if they don't do something. Obviously, they're calling this a journey, but really, they've got to look at themselves in the mirror and figure this out. I really think the only way out of this hole is a major acquisition, something like buying Anthropic or Perplexity.
Yeah.
But then again, if you're one of these companies and you're going to be worth trillions of dollars one day, like, why would you sell to Apple? So I think at this point, it's just going to be about buying enough startups to get these things rolling. There are serious concerns internally about the management and leadership of this team. If Tim Cook or the board needs to make a change, like, I don't think Tim Cook loses his job over this, but, there are fundamental concerns about John Giannandrea, who's in charge of AI. I'm not saying he should lose his job. I think the issues that he's facing are core to the way Apple operates and are way deeper than him. I'm not sure someone else could have done a better job than him, but maybe it will take someone who's already ingrained in the Apple culture and Apple lifer to get these things moving. It's very difficult for a very senior executive to come from outside the company into Apple, right? Even though he's been there since 2008 at this point, right? On top of that, coming from Google, a completely different culture. So he wasn't handed the best deck of cards here to begin with. So this goes well beyond him. Even though someone's going to have to take the fall for it, it'll end up probably being him at some point, but I'm not sure that's entirely fair.
I have a few questions to ask. Apple Maps infamously launched in September of 2012, I believe. And they've been an uphill battle to change the perception of what Apple Maps is. I think that's fair to say, in the ensuing, 12 and a half years since then. Are they going to be facing a similar now uphill road with getting people to even accept or even use an Apple Intelligence? I have Gemini set as essentially a default on my phone now. And how is this going to impact Apple's future hardware roadmap on devices that were reliant or going to be reliant on Apple Intelligence?
Okay. I just want to talk about your Maps versus
Sure.
Apple Intelligence example. So Apple Maps is a flop. I would say, man on the street, you ask people today, Apple Maps versus Google Maps, just today, it is on par. And I think there are many places where Apple Maps is superior to Google Maps. I'll just come out and say it. I'm an Apple Maps guy, right? I wasn't at the beginning, but today I think it's incredible, right?
So you don't think the launch hurt the perception of Apple Maps now? I'm not saying the service itself isn't good enough. It's great now.
I think they've gotten past it. But here's the big problem, John. But here's the big problem, John. You can't compare Apple Maps and Apple Intelligence because Google Maps has not changed in 13 years and has been stagnant, whereas the speed of artificial intelligence is changing not every 13 years, every 13 minutes. Yes.
Yeah.
So that is the difference. Google has stood still for the last decade in Apple on Google Maps. AI is not standing still. And so that's the problem Apple is grappling with. Even if they are on course to get to what they consider feature parity, to feature parity in 2 years, can you imagine how far ahead the competition is going to be when they're working the next 2 years, not on feature parity, but how to get 2 years ahead, right? And so that's the problem that Apple's fundamentally going to deal with. And really the only solution to that problem is to acquire a company that is already on track to not get to feature parity in 2 years, but something that can help Apple leapfrog where they're at right now.
So you're saying with the Maps thing, Apple was looking at a fixed point they had to get to.
Yes.
And then whereas with Apple Intelligence, it's a moving target. So when they hit that fixed point, the perception could change. People could realize it's a usable product.
It's not even a moving target. It's like the target is riding in a Lamborghini. I mean, it's just like, you see how fast these things move. Like,
yeah. Well, I saw you. Yeah. I saw you a couple weeks ago at the Amazon event.
Yes.
And in my mind, it was Apple announced something that no one else was doing. The whole Siri thing with your personal contacts, right? No one else has like ChatGPT doesn't do that. Gemini doesn't really yet. Probably will soon. And then here comes Amazon right out of the gate with essentially a better version of what Apple had announced. So when I saw you report the delay, I was almost wondering, is it because Apple felt like this is ready as we announced it, but we need to kind of expand it and make it at least match what Amazon does? And it sounds like what you were reporting was, no, they can't even get it to work right. And I mean that's crazy.
Alexa Plus, when I was watching it, I mean, it felt like exactly what you would expect Apple to do.
Yes.
Take technology of today, ChatGPT, Gemini, make it more fun, make it more personal, make it more well integrated, make it better designed. So Amazon appled ChatGPT.
They out-appled them. So what's going, like, what do you know what what is wrong with it in its current form? You ask when my mom's landing and it's like, hey, she landed 10 minutes ago, and then you ask again, she's landing tomorrow, and it's just not telling you the right answers.
It just was not working consistently and not properly. It just was not working. You had Craig Federighi complaining to the other senior executives at Apple for weeks that this stuff is not working. And I think, Craig was a big trailblazer in getting this stuff delayed. Like, felt like this stuff just cannot ship in the current form, and it's better to ship something later than something broken. But they're going back to the drawing board on this thing. Like, I think they're going to cancel the actual development work on this personal context features and these app intense features. And not that these features won't come out, but the features will come out, but like how they get to those features is going to be completely different.
How do you see this impacting Apple's hardware roadmap?
Well, the Smart Home Hub is delayed now because the Smart Home Hub was built around personal context and Apple and app intents. And it's like, if that's your big marketing push, how do you bring that device out to market? By the way, how do you bring out a 7-inch home hub when I've got a 21-inch Amazon Echo Show on my desk, right? I mean, it's just like the universe they're in on some of these hardware decisions is just mind-boggling. Like, what are the chances they even cancel this thing? So, that's, I would say, very low, by the way. But that is a consideration there. In terms of
what is this thing supposed to be?
Well, we'll get to that in a second.
Like an iPad on your screen?
It's like an iPad mini that you are able to magnetically fix to your wall, or put on a desk stand. That is just for smart home control, FaceTime, and whatnot. I think the reason they went with the square design and that smaller display is, again, back to the cannibalization question. Like, you don't want a 13-inch iPad size screen for that, because then you would just use an iPad. Or if it wasn't a different form factor, why would you buy both? In terms of the hardware question, so the Smart Home Hub in flux now. The other thing is, I think they're going to have to bring up some of the chip stuff they wanted to do, like maybe some of the graphics components and neural engines that they were planning from, 3, 4, 5 years from now. They're realizing that the models that they need to get this stuff done are way bigger than they had anticipated. So we're talking about needing more horsepower sooner than maybe they had anticipated, and bringing more horsepower across the line. The other thing is, there's a legitimate possibility that some of these features maybe are not going to be available at full throttle on iPhones that are older and iPads that are older that support Apple Intelligence, right? It's possible this could be, these features, they could become an M4 only feature or an iPhone 16 or 17 or newer feature, right? The other side of that is they release them for the older devices, but they don't work as quickly. And so we'll see what they ultimately do. I think there's no chance they're going to be able to release these features and not get them working on the 16 and 16 Pro because there's going to be tons of lawsuits, but maybe they won't be as fast as they will be on the 17 Pro. But it's so interesting. Apple Intelligence for the iPhone 16, built from the ground up for Apple Intelligence, complete, utter lie, right? And then some of these features are not going to be available until after the iPhone 17 Pro goes on sale. And I'm not saying they were trying to be disingenuous, but I am saying that the actual technical capabilities in the marketing of these products, there was a division there. And I think what you've seen from Apple is they have a go big or go home problem. I mentioned this on Twitter last night. So what stifled the car was wanting to go big. Autonomy from the very beginning. They couldn't get it done. There would have been nothing wrong with a Tesla competitor that has level 2, level 3 functionality you can build over time, right? The Vision Pro, completely overpriced and over-engineered. They could have made it a dev kit, and we could have gotten there eventually. They decided, got to go big on that. Apple Intelligence, they needed to market it as this big thing, but it doesn't meet the reality. And so I think that Apple's marketing team needs to take a look in the mirror about how they're presenting this stuff. This is, I mean, people, poked fun at Apple about AirPower. That was not a big deal. That was a $250 accessory that they probably announced, too early and were a little too confident about. Apple Intelligence, or AI, so to speak, is the future of every one of these tech companies, and they're simply not there. The question is, how many years can they withstand being this behind in AI? A lot of years, I think. And then the other thing you have to realize and not discount is the App Store, right? The fact of the matter is you can download all of these apps onto the iPhone, right? And so if you're a consumer, you're really not missing much in the grand scheme of things. Like, I'm flying through ChatGPT all day on my Apple products, right? Not through the integration, which is terrible, but through the apps themselves. The thing with the ChatGPT, by the way, like, they totally missed on the integration. I get what they were trying to do, and they did the right thing. But the fact that you can't have a back and forth, there's no conversation carryover, you're kind of just missing the whole point. Yeah, it feels like something that would be very easy to implement. And so, that alone, they could probably do in one software update and go along with.
Incredible. I feel like that was an action-packed show. I know you got to get out of here. But wow, I feel like you need a round of applause.
Mark, that was
to deliver. Yeah.
That was extremely interesting. Thank you for the insight on that.
Absolutely.
No, my pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. And feel free to have me on again, in the future as the stuff starts coming out.
Yes, for sure.
This was great.
And that is it for this edition of Geared Up. Thank you so much for listening. Of course, you can catch John and I on YouTube. I'm at youtube.com/gearlive, and John is at youtube.com/John4Lakers. Feel free to head over and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on all the latest tech. Speaking of subscribing, you can subscribe to Geared Up in your favorite podcast app if you haven't done so already. Just search Geared Up, that's 2 words, not one, in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, Overcast, or really wherever you choose to listen. If you like what we do, please consider leaving us a rating and review. It really helps other people find the show. Geared Up is a Gear Live podcast, and you can see more from us at gearlive.com. Thank you so much for listening. For John Rettinger, I'm Andrew Edwards, and we'll catch you in the next episode.